fermented foods will often be high, almost always be high, in histamine. Now, histamine is not a bad thing, but if you do have imbalances in your GI, this can lead to your immune system being a bit more overreactive, since there could be leaky gut, and part of what cleans up that reactive cascade associated with leaky gut is the immune system, and one of the primary signaling molecules of the immune system is histamine. Can you get enough probiotics from food sources? Maybe. This is something I recently have changed my mind on, and what I'd like to do is outline how much probiotic you can get from the top food sources. We'll put this in a direct side-by-side comparison table looking at probiotic supplements, and then tie in recent research that has updated what the optimal dose per day of probiotics is. And this then answers the question, can you obtain sufficient probiotic from food? And I'll give you a simple protocol for both using food, but if you're someone who might not well tolerate some high probiotic foods, I'll give you alternate protocols for using supplements. And okay, let's jump in. Firstly, common fermented foods that you may have heard of: sauerkraut, a fermented cabbage, high in vitamin C, K1, and B6. Also, there's kefir. This is a fermented milk. The nice thing about kefir in particular is it's very low in lactose. So if you are lactose intolerant, then this may be a very tolerable food source of probiotics for you. Kombucha, a fermented tea, and perhaps the most interesting, kimchi. Maybe not as popular of a fermented food, but I think one that you should really consider consuming for a few reasons. And we'll detail this in the table in a moment, but the highest dose of probiotics across most of the fermented foods occurs in kimchi. Not only that, because kimchi uses a variety of different vegetables and many different spices, you may be able to call it a superfood, even though I don't love that term. It is very diverse in terms of different vegetables, different spices, different nutrients, and the highest, generally speaking, probiotic content per serving. But let's come to this comparison table. And the backdrop to this is, if you had asked me about 5 years ago, I would have said to the question of, can you get enough probiotics from food? No, because you get about 1/10, maybe 1/4 of a serving in probiotic foods that you do from a dose of a probiotic capsule. But with more research, we're seeing two things. One, that there's a variability in the amount of probiotic in foods. And so as long as you're aiming for a minimally processed, minimally pasteurized, and fresher fermented food, you'll probably be getting a fairly sufficient dose of probiotic in that food. But also, perhaps more importantly than this, we're seeing with recent meta-analyses previewing all of the research on probiotic supplements that a lower dose than we initially thought is sufficient and might even be better. So when operating underneath a prior paradigm of the higher dose of probiotic, the better, then you could have concluded, well, food alone may be insufficient. However, with this newer data showing that the target daily dose of probiotic per day is lower than we thought, this allows us to change the conclusion to, you know what, food is probably sufficient. And let's go over to the table here that I wanted to run you through. So what you're seeing in this table, it's a little bit busy, but all the way to the left, you're seeing the Lactobacillus bifidobacterium type probiotic, the common species contained therein, and then the dose. And to every column to its left, what you're seeing is a different food: sauerkraut, yogurt, kefir, kimchi, kombucha. the species they contain, and then the dose in each one of these foods. Why this table is helpful is not to get necessarily into all of the details, but to see on more of a macro view that there's a similar, roughly speaking, number of species in a supplement as there is in various foods, and also that the dosages across either a supplement or various foods is fairly similar. So with the supplement, you're getting 1 to 50 billion, depending on the concentration of the supplement. And then with sauerkraut, 140,000 up to 14 billion. With yogurt, 1.7 million to 170 billion. With kefir, 16 million up to 250 billion. Kimchi, 15 billion to even 1.5 trillion, really high. And kombucha, 240 million up to 2.4 billion. And with the various species, you see most of the foods contain some sort of combination of lactobacillus or bifidobacterium species, although some have the healthy fungus Saccharomyces boulardii. And the dosages are not vastly different from what you see in the supplement. The key point here that ties this all together is prior thinking suggested, the evidence previously suggested, that high dosages, 50 billion, maybe even 100 billion CFU per day, was really what was needed. Now, part of this was due, in my opinion, and in my interpretation of the data, because earlier probiotic studies were using higher dosages. Over time, there's at least been an examination of, well, may we get benefit equal or better with a lower dose? And this turns out to be true. We've shared on the podcast not too long ago that 10 billion or less per day of the lactobacillus and bifidobacterium blend type probiotic supplement was found to be superior in most cases as compared to high dosages like 50 or 100 billion per day. So once we understand that 1 to 10 billion is probably the sweet spot, we look at these foods and we look at the upper limit of sauerkraut, 14 billion, yogurt, 170 billion, kefir, 250 billion, and so on. And we can at least make the inference that we're going to get the range that's ideal, perhaps even more, with foods, and we don't necessarily need to use supplements to hit that target. Now, there's also an important aspect of this to keep in mind, which is some people may not tolerate some fermented foods. Kimchi is one example. It does contain many of them, nightshades. This is the only food sensitivity that I have, but I will get very, very consistently, very, very repeatably, joint pain 24 hours after consuming red peppers, tomatoes. So for me, kimchi, not a go-to, although there is a nightshade-free, what's known as white kimchi, that doesn't use these nightshades, as something to consider. But nevertheless, this is one area in which foods may be problematic, even though I am a food first, I guess my philosophy is food first. Now, another thing to be on the lookout for, some people, and I really thank the people I've worked with over the years to help me see this, comment something to the effect of, the better I eat, the worse I feel. Now, there can be a few different reasons for this. It could be you're eating too much fiber, too much roughage, too much prebiotic. And this is where something like a low FODMAP diet can be helpful, or even when people skew more in the direction of meat-based, that's a good move for some people. The other component to this is that fermented foods will often be high, almost always be high, in histamine. Now, histamine is not a bad thing, but if you do have imbalances in your GI, this can lead to your immune system being a bit more overreactive, since there could be leaky gut, and part of what cleans up that reactive cascade associated with leaky gut is the immune system, and one of the primary signaling molecules of the immune system is histamine. So you may notice, boy, I was feeling good, and then I had a kombucha with my quick lunch of canned tuna and spinach and maybe a little bit of sauerkraut. And I was irritable, foggy, something like this. That could mean that you are histamine sensitive. And this is where the supplements, at least in the short term, can be helpful because probiotic supplements are net antihistamine. This is crucially important to make this one distinction because you will see many products, probiotics that is, marketing themselves as being histamine free. And this does not matter because the net impact of probiotics is antihistamine. Well, why is that? Because probiotics reduce leaky gut, a source of histamine, correct dysbiosis and SIBO, sources of histamine. Okay. So that has been corroborated by randomized control trials finding reductions in things like seasonal allergy and runny nose. So we know that probiotic supplements have a net antihistamine effect, and even though they may contain a small amount of histamine in them, they will reduce your overall histamine levels. With foods, they're going to contain more histamine and may be problematic for some people, at least short term. So what you may want to do instead, only if you've noticed clear and reproducible reactivity to high histamine foods, fermented foods, take some time away from those, use a supplement for a few months or the probiotic, and then come back to and reintroduce the foods. And you should almost for certain have improved tolerance over time if you use probiotic supplements effectively. Also, it's not to say that nobody will have reactions to a probiotic supplement, but this is why we've broken them out into lactobacillus with bifidobacterium versus Saccharomyces boulardii versus soil-based. I've seen no one who can't tolerate at least one of these. And it really doesn't seem to have anything to do with the histamine, but rather just personalizing one of these three to the individual and their immune system. As the one works, the person heals, their tolerance increases, and they can usually tolerate a second or third formula and or fermented foods. By the way, thank you so much for watching. If this video has been helpful, please like, subscribe, and comment. I would be very curious to hear your experience here, and I'll try to respond to as many of the comments as I can. Okay, now another question we should be asking is, if we compare trials, is there a difference in benefit or effect or efficacy of the foods versus the supplements? Now, there's two ways of framing this answer. One is if we're literally evidence-based, we could miss a very important component to this answer. There are more studies with probiotic supplements. There are less studies and less rigorous studies and less quality data with foods. But why is that? Almost for certain, it's an issue of funding. There is not nearly as much funding for foods because there's not as much of a market for foods, nor can a company claim a proprietary blend. So there's a natural, not nefarious, but just a natural market pressure here that leads to more funding for, therefore, better research on the probiotic supplements. So we want to be careful not to miss that when we're interpreting the studies, because again, there are clearly larger and more rigorous trials with the supplements, whereas the food studies are oftentimes observational or very small, therefore limiting the quality of the data. But because we know, as we reviewed a moment ago, the contents, probiotic-wise, of the foods versus the supplements are very similar, I have zero hesitancy recommending to start with foods first and then reevaluate. And hopefully consuming a few servings per day or per week, I think that's a decent range, at very least a few servings per week, maybe a few servings per day of fermented foods, will help improve whatever the symptoms are that you're struggling with. And after 1 or 2 months, if you're not seeing the traction, the improvement that you're looking for, that's when layering on top of that probiotic supplements makes sense. The one other important aside here I wanted to make, you may read as you can read almost anything on the internet, that probiotics may cause brain fog. And this was a hypothesis initially put forth by Satish Rao, or at least he really popularized this belief. And it's really quite poor science in the sense that there is no good data that has demonstrated that probiotics can cause brain fog. Now, to be very careful and to equip you with the knowledge armament not to fall into this confusion, this was a story that was wildly circulated by the media based upon one study. The data in the study did not support the conclusion at all, and there was a severe backlash by the research community criticizing Rao, even though I appreciate Rao and his work, for kind of half-baked conclusions that scared people away from either probiotic foods or supplements. And when you look at the impressive body of data demonstrating probiotics can help a myriad of conditions, the research community rightfully criticized, you may be scaring people away from foods or supplements that could otherwise help them. And therefore, you are doing more of a detriment than you are a positive when considering that your conclusion was in no way supported by your data. We've also talked on the podcast in the past very specifically this recent study looking at a condition known as mild hepatic encephalopathy. Now, hepatic encephalopathy is a disease state in which the liver is so overworked it cannot filter the blood appropriately, and then toxins can build up in the brain and cause cognitive impairment. The very interesting thing about this is that both antibiotics and or probiotics have shown the ability to rectify this hepatic encephalopathy, which can cause brain fog. But that's more of a severe disease state. We can't extrapolate too far from that. But in the model of mild hepatic encephalopathy, we see that probiotics again can improve this more mild condition, in where, said simply, the liver is a bit taxed or overworked, and this correlates with MCI, mild cognitive impairment. So to refute Rao's theoretical hypothesis, we have hard clinical data showing that probiotic supplements can reduce mild hepatic encephalopathy and the cognitive impairment or brain fog that ensues as a byproduct of that. So when we zoom out, we see clearly that probiotics can help with cognition. And I just want to take a few moments to clarify that, because we'll see people who are confused about probiotics if they have brain fog. And I would encourage you not to worry about that, unless the one caveat would be you notice fermented foods don't sit well with you. And we covered a moment ago what to do if that's the case. Okay, so let's distill this down to recommendations. Partially in recap, make fermented foods either a daily or weekly part of your diet. I would aim for a variance of different fermented foods, because we know differing intakes of the vegetable matter that's fermented in these leads to a more diverse microbiota, and you're going to have different species of probiotic in these different foods. There's going to be some overlap, sure, but you'll also get some nuanced differences if you choose different foods. Along with that, look for non or minimally pasteurized, because that will mean that the fermentation and therefore the bacteria are more intact. Look for live active cultures, look for organic, and be a little bit careful about added sugars. Is some added sugar going to be the end of the world? No, but added sugar, as added fat, can sneak up on you and your diet and lead to this caloric creep. So just something to be on the lookout for. And remember that kimchi may be one of the best. And so if you're not consuming kimchi, consider it. And we'll also link to what's known as mild white kimchi, which I'm actually quite excited to try, because this will be nightshade free. Try this. Give this a couple months, the consumption regularly of fermented foods, and then reevaluate. If you're happy with how you feel, awesome. Yeah, you're done. If you're not, that's when you can consider a probiotic supplement. And here is a table that gives you sort of the long, short, but distillation of a lot of data regarding how to use probiotics supplementally. And as you see from this visual, you can break down probiotics to 3 types to really cut through the confusion and the marketing spin, or the marketing spin masquerading as science, which happens a lot. You have 3 different types: blends of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, or Saccharomyces boulardii, or a soil-based probiotic. The dosages in order are between 1 to 10 billion per day for the lactobif, between 10 and 15 for the sac, and between 2 and 6 billion for the soil-based. Also remember that benefits tend to peak between the second and third month. So you want to give yourself about a month to evaluate, is this helping, yes or no? Usually you'll have an intuitive sense even before that, but give yourself a month to say the probiotics are helping, yes or no. If they are, continue, and you may see the pinnacle or the peak of improvement by the second or third month. Coming back to the initial question, can you get enough probiotics from food? The answer is yes. And thankfully, as we're learning more about probiotics, we're realizing we don't need mega doses that can only be obtained from supplements, although there may be a time and a place for that, and that foods are a good source. And also we have probiotics as a supplement on top of foods if foods seem to be insufficient. Keep an eye out for reactivity of some of these foods, and remember that with a little bit of doctoring or supplementing, you can usually be able to tolerate fermented foods. And per the usual, always check these recommendations with your doctor, but hopefully this helps you navigate and to create a dietary plan for the use of probiotic-rich foods.